Welcome to our overview for Sunday school teachers and Bible study leaders of Lifeway's Explore the Bible lesson of John chapter 12, verses 1 through 11, with the title, Why Wasn't This Sold? There's a couple ways you could introduce this lesson, depending on what you think best fits your particular class. One way would be by mentioning the revival that's been going on at Asbury, Kentucky. It's been on the news, Twitter, Facebook, and so a lot of people will be familiar with it, and also with some of the criticism that has been made about it. Some leaders have said that it's not a genuine revival since it doesn't focus on preaching, but is rather mostly just worship and prayer, or they're not playing the right kind of music in their services or whatever. Then you could say today we're going to look at John chapter 12 and another instance of how someone's gift or service to God was criticized. Or you could begin by looking at this quote from Theodore Roosevelt Sr., the father of President Teddy Roosevelt. You might start off with this class, with this quote maybe written on your dry erase board or whatever. And here's the quote. I always believe in showing affection by doing what will please the one we love, not by talking. That's from David McCullough's book, Mornings on Horseback, page 31. I would share that quote and then ask your group, what do you think about that quote? And so you could talk about that, doing or saying. I think, and my conclusion is, I think I know what Roosevelt means, that showing love with actions is important, but I might conclude both are actually good. Both doing and talking can be expressions of love. But you can talk about that for a while and then say, today we're going to look at a couple of different ways of showing love to the Lord from John chapter 12. So our context here today in John 1 through 11, the quarter we just finished, we studied the first part of Jesus' ministry on earth, built around the 7 miracles or signs and the 7 I am statements. Now we come to John 12 that focuses on the last days of Jesus on earth, his death and resurrection and last appearances and instructions to his disciples. Last week we looked at the resurrection of Lazarus, maybe Jesus' greatest miracle on earth, but it also set the Pharisees on a determined course to kill Jesus. In chapter 11, verse 50, Caiaphas, the high priest, said it's expedient for one man to die for the people. So everything now points to the cross, which of course was God's ultimate plan. So we start this week's lesson in John 12, where Jesus comes again to Bethany, dines with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, you could potentially spend a lot of time talking about, is this the same event as the one in Luke 7, or is this in the family's house or at Simon's house? I personally wouldn't focus as much on those details as much as I would with the spiritual lessons that are involved here and how we need to apply them in our life, how we need to show our love to the Lord, and so on. It's where I would spend my time. Outline-wise, I might do something like this. Point 1, different love gifts to the Lord in verses 1 through 3. And point 2, criticism of the love gifts in verses 4 through 8. And then point 3, identifying with Jesus. So let's look at the text and some illustrations and applications of it. Point number 1, the differing gifts. I might read verses 2 or 3, or have somebody in your group read them and then ask, what ways of showing love to Jesus do you see in these verses? I think we really see several. In verse 2, it says Martha was serving. That's what Martha does, isn't it? You think of Luke 10, 38 to 42, the familiar story of Mary and Martha. Martha's all busy about the preparations for the meal while Mary sits at Jesus' feet. You might be ready to read that story. Serving is what Martha does. We might say Martha was being Martha. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. I think we should use our gifts to serve the Lord. Her gift was obviously service. There are other ways to worship and serve Jesus, so we shall see. But Martha was using hers here. And if this was indeed not Mary and Martha's home, but Simon's, it says something that Martha was serving even at Simon's home, even though it wasn't her home. Serving was her love language in a sense. So then you might look at verse 2. It says Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with Jesus. In those days, they didn't sit around in chairs around a dining table like we do, but they reclined on their sides to eat. That's what Lazarus was doing. He was reclining to eat with Jesus. Is that showing love too? Spending quality time with somebody? I think it is. Then verse 3 says, Mary took the costly perfume and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair. That's, of course, a very remarkable way to show love for Jesus. It's more exotic, certainly, than Martha's or Lazarus's, and very touching. It was a very costly sacrifice. Judas said it could be sold for 300 denarii, a year's wages, as we shall see. Then using her hair to dry it was a violation of common social mores. But as we shall see in verse 7, Jesus said, "Leave her alone." He accepted the gift that she gave him. So one thing I might point out in this passage is the contrasting ways the different family members showed their love to Jesus. One by the way she served, another by the time and fellowship that he shared, another by the way that she gave very extravagantly. So a number of different ways of showing love here. Now, if you didn't use the Theodore Roosevelt Sr. quote in the introduction, you could use it here. Talk about doing versus talking, and you could talk about words can show love and deeds can show love. Just some different ways of showing love. You could talk about what are some ways we can show our love to the Lord by our words. Saying I love you, Lord, singing I love you, Lord, praise psalms, thanksgiving. There's a lot of biblical ways to show him love by our words. We just need to make sure they're backed up by our heart and by our actions. Another illustration and application I might use here is author Gary Chapman's book, The 5 Love Languages. In that book, Chapman suggests 5 different means of showing love to others: spending quality time, giving gifts, physical touch, acts of service, and words of affirmation. Chapman says if you care for somebody, you should try to see which of these 5 best conveys love to them and try to show your love to them in the way that they want. So in light of that, you could talk about what are some of your favorite ways of showing love to people, or the best way to demonstrate love to people you know. I think it can be helpful in light of Chapman's book to know what your love language is, and also to know what the love language is of the people you want to show love to. You might want to prefer to show love in one way, but it'd be more effective if you could show it the way that they are more receptive to. My wife Cheryl has a theory that we all need all of these, but we tend to think we need most the one that maybe we're not receiving as much. But the point I would make is, just as there are different ways of showing our love to people, there are some different ways to show our love to God as well. And we see that in this passage with Jesus and Mary and Martha and Lazarus. They each showed their love in a different way. So one way I would apply this for my class would be to ask, how do you think that you personally best show your love to God? My answer might be, well, in my daily worship time, singing, quoting psalms, being excited to praise him and know who he is and his word. I think I can show my love by obeying him, by doing some hard things. You and your group can share how you think you show your love to the Lord. We have a lady in our church who said she told the Lord, when I retire, I want to spend my full time serving you. And she does. She's like having another full-time staff member in the church. And she does it just for love for the Lord. I think she's definitely a Martha in the best sense of showing her love for God through her service. But we see here in John 12, there's more than one way to express our love for the Lord. The important thing is do it. Show your love for the Lord. Love will express itself. And we need to make sure that we are expressing our love to the Lord. Then I've moved to the second point then, criticism of the gift. The gift was described, and then we see the criticism of it beginning in verse 4. Verse 4 begins, but. Reading this first part of the story, you might think, oh, what a great gift from Mary. But, it says, but there's always somebody who doesn't like how someone else is serving Jesus. Judas said in verse 5, this is a waste. Could have been sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor. A denarius was a 1 day's wage for a common working man. If you look in Matthew 20, verse 2, in the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, the landowner agrees with the laborers for a denarius for the day. So 1 denarius was pretty much a working man's wage for a day. So 300 denarii, that's pretty much a year's wages for a working person. Mary poured out a year's salary on Jesus in this act. It was indeed extravagant. But someone's well said, no good deed will go unpunished. It does seem that no matter what good thing you try to do, somebody is going to criticize it. And we see that here in John 12. You might share some other criticisms of someone's love or service for the Lord. If you didn't talk about Asbury in the what happened there and in the introduction, you might do it at this point. One article I read indicated many of the students were hurt by the criticism many leveled on the revival because it wasn't being done the way the critics thought that it should. A scriptural example might be in 2 Samuel 6 in the Old Testament with David and Michal. They were bringing up the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. David was so excited. It says he was dancing with all his might before the Lord. But what did David's wife Michal do? She criticized David. How the king distinguished himself today, she said, dancing before the people. David was worshiping God with all his heart, but she criticized it. You may think of other examples of people doing that, criticizing the way that someone else is worshiping God. And you might ask, why do you think that people might criticize the gifts and worship of others? Probably could be several motivations. We see one in verse 6. It says he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. One thing I might point out here, just because it kind of sticks in my craw a little bit, sometimes in movie portrayals of the gospel, they'll paint Judas as somebody who really had a good heart and loved Jesus, but he was just trying to force his hand into showing who he was by giving him over to the Jews. This passage shows us otherwise. Judas did not have a good heart. He was a thief. He did not have a good motivation. But Judas offers us some application here. Oftentimes, when there is criticism of someone else's worship or ministry, there's something else behind it. A personal sin, like Judas had here, or a wrong motivation, or a personal dislike or affront. They just don't like the person, or they've done something to offend them. So oftentimes there is something behind it like that, just like we see here in Judas. But then also, just to keep a balance here, does everyone who ever critiques a ministry always have a bad motivation? Well, I'd have to say not necessarily. I think sometimes there can be a genuine concern. Is this biblical? Surely there's a legitimate place to question if something's biblical or not, or is this the wisest course or not, if it's done from a good conscience and a pure motivation. There's lots of points of application for churches today here. You apply this passage as God leads you, but I think one of the lessons here is certainly we should be very careful about criticizing other people's worship or ministry. Paul wrote in Romans 14:4, "Who are you to judge the servant of another? God is the one who will judge everything that is said or done, and he knows hearts, he knows motives. We can't, so we had best leave that to him. Don't judge the servant of another." But Jesus affirmed her worship. Verse 7, he said, "Leave her alone. She may keep it for the day of my burial." And he added in verse 8, you always have the poor with you. You might talk about what do you think he meant by that? You can always give something to the poor, but you can't always minister to him personally like this. There also might be an element of, you can probably criticize every gift and say, shouldn't you have done something else with it? You can keep second guessing, and it can keep you from doing anything. And is there a legitimate place to talk about stewardship in regard to what we do with our gifts or our money? I think so. I think, can we ask, would it be better to spend $10,000 on a stained glass window or send a missionary to a foreign country for 6 months instead with that same money? I think there is a place to genuinely wrestle with these decisions if we are doing it with pure motives. But this passage also shows us there is also a place to give an extravagant gift to Jesus, and that he loves it when we do. As always, the heart is the key. Was the heart of the giver right? What was the heart of Judas right? Obviously, here in John 12, Mary's heart was right, and Judas was not. So whatever position we take, we need to make sure our heart is right with God in it. And then finally, point 3, verse 9 says that people came, but it says they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. When God does something in our life, people will want to see it, and it will influence them when they do. But we see two different responses to Lazarus here. Verse 10 says the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also. Verse 11 says, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. So really we see two kind of different responses here. If we follow Jesus, if Jesus does something in our life, there will always be some people who believe and who will follow him because of us. And then there will be some who oppose us. It has always been that way, and it will always be that way. We see this all through John. There arose again a division among them because of him. So there will always be some who believe, some who do not. But we must not be afraid of identifying with Jesus. And one way of applying this portion of the text, you might ask your group here, Lazarus was identified with Jesus. What are some ways that we today can identify with Jesus? Well, I would suggest several ways. We identify him, first of all, with baptism and confession of our faith. We're identifying ourselves with him, and it's important that we take that step. We can identify with him by sharing our testimony with others, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. By witnessing to others about Jesus, we identify with him. By the way we live our life, we identify with him. You and your group can share others. And then you might also talk with your group about this. Have you or someone you know ever been reacted to negatively, like Lazarus was, because you identified with Jesus? For example, I've had a door slammed in my face. I've had people criticize me in the paper when I wrote an article saying that Jesus was the only way to God. I've had some threatening moments in India on some mission trips. All in all, in my own life, not much compared with the New Testament apostles and what people we know are suffering worldwide. But you and your group can share any experiences you may have had. The point is, we need to be ready to suffer negative consequences for the Lord. This passage shows us we should be ready to show Jesus our love the best ways that we can. We should avoid criticizing others for the way that they show him their love. And we should be ready to suffer for identifying with him if we need to. Well, I hope this gives you a start or some help on your lesson for Sunday. Remember, if you'd like to read or print a text version of this overview, maybe to get the Roosevelt quote or whatever, you can get it on my blog at www.ShawnThomas.com. If you'll hit subscribe, hit the little bell on this video, YouTube will automatically send you next week's video and you won't have to search for it. And if you write something in the comment section below, I'll be sure to pray for you and your group by name this week. For my licensing agreement with Lifeway, these weekly lessons are based on content from Explore the Bible adult resources. The presentation is my own. It has not been reviewed by Lifeway. Lifeway resources are available at goexplorethebible.com and goexplorethebible.com/adults-training. And if you have questions about Explore the Bible resources, you can send emails to explorethebible@lifeway.com.